Hello, hello, hello. So here's my book synopsis of River of Darkness by some dude, and it's about Francisco de Orellana. Oh no, the I guess the based on his reports. I don't know what book he got the writer got his information from, but it was written in 2011. I got it off of Amazon, Amazon books on Audible, and I think I have a membership of Audible, so I get free credits every few months. It's a book about the very first trip from a European explorer from the western coast of South America to the eastern coast of South America, the first person to cross the continent. And I wanted to do my next book review, book synopsis on Diogenes. I think I'll do that tomorrow, but I decided to just go ahead and do this one because I saw a clip from Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan, and he's talking about how there's from they know from Francisco de Orellana that the first European to go down the Amazon, that the Amazon used to be jam packed with people. Graham Hancock said that it was they estimated 20 million people lived in the Amazon in those days, and that there were all bunch of cities that had 50,000 people. So I was super intrigued by that and had to read the book or listen to the book right away. I don't read books; I listen to books. So I got the book last night, and this morning I got the book. I started listening to the book, and I went on a run. Listening to the book, I ran down to Mount Sanitas and climbed Mount Sanitas and ran back and kind of realized I couldn't run anymore, so I had to call my mom to pick me up. And then I just was working on my timeline, kylepounds.com timeline, fixing the castles for the rest of the day and listening to the book. And I finished it, the whole book today. It was about a 9-hour long book with like 22 chapters, 9 hours and something minutes. Excuse the yawning. I'm not tired. I just yawn all the time. It's the book is the long version of the conquistadors. He gives the introduction to the conquistadors and how they took over Peru and the Incan civilization, and then ended the book talking about what happened with Francisco Orellana with the end and Pizarro, the Incan civilization. So when the Spanish, this is one of the most interesting epochs of of world history, the most interesting generation. It's kind of hard to listen to, though, because it's kind of tragic. But in 1492, Columbus sailed the open seas looking for India, and he made it to the Cayman Islands, and he did 4 trips down there, and then soon after, all the other Spaniards, conquistadors, went down to the Americas. Cortez took over the Aztec Empire with just a few boats full of dudes with their guns. Amazingly, they had a huge city called Tenochtitlan that was in this huge lake that doesn't exist anymore. But in the south, it's where Mexico City now is, and in the middle of the lake they had an island, and then a bunch of little islands, so they would get around on a little boat. It was just like like Venice. This must have been beautiful. They have drawings of it, and some of the canals still exist in southern Mexico City. Just like how Cortez took over the Aztec Empire, Pizarro, there was like 5 Pizarro brothers I think it was Francisco Pizarro was the oldest who originally took over the Incas. Yeah, they just by themselves they went over and took over the whole Incan Empire because they had guns, and they were much better fighters than the Native Americans. They had metal armor, and they had razor sharp swords, and they trained their whole lives at sword play and fighting with armor, and they had pistols. It was kind of in the beginning of guns, and they had these huge rifles that they would put on tripods called arquebuses, and that was enough to scare the living daylights out of the Indians. The Indians would come in formation like they're gonna kick your ass, and then you would fire the arquebus one time and go through somebody and kill the person behind him, and then they just run in terror. So when the Spaniards came to the Incans, they went over and sailed down the western coast of South America, and they first went to Quito and set up Guayaquil in Ecuador, and then went down and I think founded Lima, and then they found these really very well maintained roads, perfectly paved with stones. So they just easily just rode their horses right up the roads, all the way to the capital of the Incan Empire, and which was in Cuzco at the time. And just as luck would have it, when all of the Europeans went to South America, it was right in the middle of a civil war. The first Europeans went down there and said hi and did a little bit of looking around, and then they went back and said, hey, there's some Indians, Native Americans dressed in South America, dressed in gold, and there's gold all over. So they got super excited about the gold and went down there. And so when they went down there, the big pack of them with the Pizarro and their men, I don't know how many there were, but it was like maybe a few hundred. In four, like Columbus went back his final time in 4 boats, and I think his first time in 4 boats, because I think 4 boats would have been an expedition, and in 4 boats you can put in like 300 dudes, so they probably had like 300 guys. And when they went back to the Incan Empire, they found the Incan Empire in a full-blown civil war. So they never said why they were in a civil war. At least I don't know why, but maybe it had something to do with differences on how they were going to handle the approaching Europeans. But they took advantage of that and basically stormed their way into the capital of Cuzco, of the Incan civilization in Cuzco, and took the king, I think his name was Tupac Amur, hostage. And in order to try to save his life, the king, Tupac, told the Spaniards that he would ransom himself off with gold, because he noticed the Spaniards loved gold. So he told them that he could provide them with a huge room full of gold, like packed to halfway to the ceiling with gold within a year. And so they gave him a chance to send his emissaries throughout the 4 corners of his empire. And the Incan Empire was big. It stretched from Quito, Ecuador, all the way down to Santiago, Chile. I lived in Santiago, Chile 5 years, and I heard there was this one road. It's a main road in Santiago that heads out north, and I heard that it was originally an Incan road. So, and so the entire empire was connected with these really good paved roads. They're really civilized and had beautiful trinkets and gold, and but the Spaniards were only interested in boiling them down into Spanish coins to then ship back to Spain and get rich. So yeah, they ended up, he held true to his promise, the king of Inca, and gave them a whole room full of gold. But after they got the gold, they killed they killed the king of Inca. So the South American conquistadors set in motion a very evil trajectory of bad behavior in South America. I think that's why in South America everybody's lying, cheating, and stealing and murdering each other, because that's what the conquistadors did from the very beginning. What, I sometimes I look at South Americans and I see these like ugly, evil-looking dudes, and I can picture how they're descendants of conquistadors. And yeah, they're still racist to this day, but let's not talk about that. Yeah, so what happened was then they decided that Pizarro, the leader, I think there were like four brothers. There was the oldest brother was 30 years older than the youngest brother. The youngest was 17, and the oldest was like 27, 37, like 47 years old, and one of the Pizarros, I don't know which one, but and then he had a second in command called Francisco de Orellana, which is what the book is about. Decided that they were going to look for this city called El Dorado, because the Incans said that if they wanted gold, they should go into the jungle, because that's where all the gold was, in the kingdom of El Dorado. So maybe they were just saying that to get them out of their hair and hope they die in the jungle, get eaten by a snake, and stuck by a poison arrow by the Indians or something. But the conquistadors decided to go into the Amazon and try to cross the entire continent. And Orellana, they managed to do it. He went down the Amazon River. So they started by going up over the mountains. They had to go over a 17,000 foot pass, and the roads led them very well. They had great paved roads. I hiked the Incan Trail once, a long time ago, and it was like 4 days of hiking from Cusco to Machu Picchu, and we were walking on Incan trails that the Incans made hundreds of years ago, and they were perfectly paved, really wide as roads, trails, just paved with stones. And so that's what the roads were like then. And they went over a 17,000 foot pass, which was higher than when the roads went. They weren't paved that high, and managed to get their horses over there. And they brought a bunch of Indians as like guides and slaves, and female Indians to cook their food for them and serve as sex slaves. And then they went into the jungle, and it got really difficult for them because it was just really thick jungle, and they ended up having to eat all their dogs and horses, and then they were hacking their way through and not making very good progress, and then realized that the best way that they were going to be able to be successful is if they just went down the river, because it was covered in really big. They found the Amazon River there. I'm gonna look for his. I don't have it. But if you type his name, you'll see the map, how they went over from. They started in going west right about at the latitude of about like Ecuador, like Quito, Ecuador, and that's about where the Amazon River is. And at one point, Pizarro, they got stuck and they were starving, and Orellana, they had an Indian guide who told them that if he went down to the next river and then took a left and went up the other river, they would find food, and they'd find like a kingdom. And so Orellana separated himself from Pizarro to go find food, and he was going to come back, but he never came back. So Pizarro figured he got abandoned and ended up retreating and going back into where they came from, and survived and went back, but vowed eternal vengeance again or against Orellana because he thought he abandoned him. But so the book is about Orellana. So Francisco de Orellana, they ended up, I think he had like 50 guys or something with him. They ended up making 2 boats. Even though none of them were actual professional builders, they had one guy who was a carpenter and had overseen carpentry, and so they just used their basic knowledge to build a couple of rowboats that could be rowed by like 16 guys, 8 oars each side, kind of like a Viking vessel. And they used these 2 boats to row all the way down the Amazon River. And in a matter of, oh man, I wish I had remembered to at least type his name. Here, I'll click back here. And I think it was like a matter of like a year or something where because they have dates attached to it. Here's his map of where they went and all the places that they talked about. There's another map that shows the dates. So they were going down the river, and they had to. It's a very similar story as the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition was only like 50 dudes, and which is just about big enough to survive because they have guns. The Native Americans weren't really organized enough to make these huge armies that would be able to defeat the Lewis and Clark expedition. They were always just a little bit stronger than whatever band of Indians came across, and so they would fight. They were able to fight them off, and that's kind of like how Orellana. Some of the Indians were friendly to them and gave them food, probably out of fear, and other ones fought against them. But the Spaniards managed to fight pretty well because they had their giant rifles, their arquebuses, and their crossbows and their swords and armor. And but the interesting thing about the book, and the reason that I read the book, was because I wanted to just hear what Graham Hancock was talking about, that there were these huge cities and all these people and civilized people living down the Amazon. And at the end of the book, the writer said that they estimated 5 million people lived in the Amazon. So I don't know where Graham Hancock got his 20 million people report from, but and I don't. They never said anything about there being cities of 50,000 people. But Orellana did say that at one point they went down for a 20-mile stretch of the river. It was just at one point it was just houses, just a line of houses all the way down the river of people for 20 miles. And at another point it was like 10 miles or something of nothing but houses, like house to house to house to house, connecting each other all the way down the river. So there were a lot more people living there than now. While he was going down the river, he noted in his journal that the Indians that they brought with them would not handle the smallpox nearly as well as the Spaniards. As soon as an Indian got smallpox, their whole body would be covered in those boils, and it'd be so bad. It was so bad that it would just cover up and make them blind. They couldn't even see at all, so they became useless, and they just had to leave them at camp, just like wailing and moaning on the ground. And I think all of their Indians ended up dying that way. So that was the beginning, and I guess that's why when the next time the Europeans came down the Amazon, there were like all the civilization was gone. You didn't see miles and miles of houses. It was they were decimated by then, but they were very civilized. They had they had perfectly maintained roads that went in, like paved roads that went into the jungle from the river from these towns. So they had a civilization. It wasn't just jungle people like it is now. And they pretty much had a common language. Orellana was very good at picking up languages. and he learned the language up in the western part of the Amazon, and it served him for like the entire time down the Amazon. So there was a whole lot of trade and communication going between the Indians and the Amazon, and there were entire villages or cities of people who specialized in one commodity. He wrote about how they were very good at farming turtles. They would have these huge pens of turtles, and they would harvest the turtles by like cutting holes in their and then the little baby turtle shells and dragging them up and feeding them and fattening them to feed an entire family. And they they also did a certain kind of farming with this dirt that they would make out of simmering the grass at like a low burn. And I was looking actually in the Amazon, and I saw some smoke from fires. I don't know if it's still from that, or maybe they're just clear cutting. But yeah, the Amazon rainforest does not have very fertile earth. It doesn't go down very far. But if you know how to farm it, then you can grow a lot of the sustenance that you need. And so the Indians were very civilized with that, highly technologically evolved. And so there was there was one story where they found one town that was specialized in like golden trinkets, where it was just a depot of all these silverware and stuff that was like a depot. They would go into these towns and during the day, and it would just be some women, and but then at night the men would come back, and they had to fight off a bunch of them, but they managed to survive pretty well. But their boat got just totally covered in arrows. Like it would look like a porcupine, just arrows sticking out of their boat. And but the most interesting part of the book is why the Amazon River is called the Amazon River. And I didn't know why the Amazon River was called that. It was originally called the River of Orellana, named after that guy who was the first European to sail down it. But the reason the river is called the Amazon River is because they named it after the Amazon women of ancient Greek mythology. In ancient Greek mythology, there was a kingdom of Amazon of women. It was just women, and it was in like modern day southeast coast of the Black Sea. And at one point, some Greeks from Athens actually kidnapped a bunch of Amazons to take them back as like slaves. And so they gathered up an army with some of their neighboring Sarmatian tribes and attacked Athens. And like Athens, it was like a real war, but Athens ended up winning, and apparently that was the end of the Amazon kingdom. They went and the surviving Amazons became part of the Sarmatian tribes again. But the reason they call them the Amazons is because at one point they they were going down the river, and different Indians who were some of them were nice, were telling them, be careful about. There was one Indian chief who actually was very friendly and approached them and wanted to help them out, but they took him as a prisoner, and made him like as a forced guide. But then he put him in chains. But he finally escaped with his friends. They swam across the river together, even though they were in chains. But they were telling them, like, be careful about the Indians farther down the river. And I think this is maybe around like Guayaquil, like halfway down the river. Actually, maybe I should look at the thing. Yeah, the Amazons were about 2/3 of the way down the Amazon. They told them to beware of the Indians down farther below because they were very warlike and they took people as slaves. At one point, the Spaniards looked and they were seeing people being roasted over a fire. They saw the hands and the feet, and that freaked them out. But they at one point they got attacked by these huge Indians who were 2 heads taller than the tallest Spaniard. And so that's interesting because you hear about the giants, legends of giants, and even they found skeletons of giants in North America and South America. There was one Spanish conquistador. I think he was the first one to navigate around the Cape of Magellan on the southern tip of South America, and there was a story that he came across in Tierra del Fuego some giant Native Americans who were, and he was big. He was 6'3", so I guess some of the Spaniards were pretty big in those days. But with the Indian put his arm out like this, his head could easily go under his arm. So the Indians were like 7'5", and there were these Indians who attacked the Spaniards in these canoes at one point in the Amazon. I think not so far away from when they met the Amazon women, but it was these Indians who covered themselves in black paint, and they smushed their foreheads were totally flat. Since they were babies, they flattened their foreheads with wood in these little baby canoes, so that they looked really scary looking because they had they were really ugly, these really big flat foreheads. I think he likened it to I can't remember what it was, but it was like they had these big square flat foreheads, and those Indians were 2 heads taller than the tallest Indian. And so I looked on Google, and a head is like 8 to 12 inches. So you're talking like 16 to 24 inches taller than the tallest Spaniards, and the tallest Spaniard was like 6'3". So you're talking dudes who were like 7.5 feet tall. And those were the ones who were attacking them the most. But they survived them, and then at one point they got attacked by some other Indians who had these poisoned arrows, and if it even pierced your skin, you would die. One guy got hit in the foot, and then but it wasn't even that hard. Like, one guy got hit in the foot, and he was just screaming in excruciating pain, saying he knew he was going to die for sure. And they should have cut his foot off at that point. Maybe he lived, but yeah, the next day they could see how his leg was getting gangrenous as the poison was just working its way up his leg. And then the next day it hit his heart and he died. And then another guy got hit by an arrow, but the arrow didn't even go far in enough to stick. It hit him, and then the arrow fell out all on its own. But that guy died of the poison, so they figured they got the poison from the poison frogs and from a poisonous bark. But they managed to survive. They made after they realized how dangerous it was, they just slept on the boat, and they could hide under the boat, so the boat would get hit by the arrows and not them. But then at one point, and here's the most interesting part of the story, is when they actually met these Amazon women. they got attacked at one point, and I think this was the biggest battle they had, by these these tribes of Indians, but their leaders were women who were extremely tall. So I guess, and also very robust, very like very muscular and thick, and they were naked except for covering their privates, so they're butt naked in G strings, like probably like 7.5 feet tall and 300 pounds. But they had these little these Indians with them, warrior Indians who were clearly being led by the women, and it was like a dozen women, and they had really light skin, and they had really long hair that they tied in braids, and then wrapped the braids around their heads. So kind of even like like a like a picture of Amazon warriors in ancient Greece. But they were accompanied by the like regular Indian warriors who weren't, I guess, just like weren't big like them, but they were making them fight the front lines, and it was clear that the women were making them fight, and if the men turned around and tried to run, they would get killed by a club. The women would just kill them, and but the women also had they had clubs, but they also had bows and arrows. And the boat got hit by one of the arrows that one of the women shot, and it was a whole span long, so it was like a 6 foot long arrow. And they managed to kill a couple of the Amazon women, but so then after that, they escaped and went down the river. But they were talking to the Indians, and apparently, all of the Indians knew about the Amazon women. And there were stories that Indians, like Native Americans from even 3,000 miles away, would make pilgrimages down the river and across the jungle just to meet the women, to make sure, just to see that they really existed. But the story goes that their village was inland, but they saw the paved roads that went in, and that they lived in stone buildings, and but only women were allowed to live there, and that they would go out and like kidnap men whenever they wanted to get pregnant, but no men were ever allowed inside of the city after dark. And if the babies were born male, they would either kill the baby or bring the baby out and give it to the surrounding tribes. And so that's interesting, because when I was listening to Graham Hancock, he was saying that they're doing this type of I can't remember what it's called, but they shoot infrared light over the jungle canopy, and they can look at the contour of the earth. And I saw they had pictures of I should do a better job in my videos, but they had pictures of these like pyramids, square shaped stone structures, in lots of them in these big cities. So it's true that there were stone cities and people living in stone houses in the jungle. That'd be amazing to actually get on Google Earth and see where they're talking about. But in the book, they were saying that, yeah, all of the Indians agreed that they were real and that they had seen them, and so maybe how they existed was they were related to those flat-headed Indians that attacked them. They were offshoot of them, and so they were mating with those Indians, but maybe with normal Indians, and so maybe they didn't find them again after, because they all died of smallpox, because they didn't have the immunity to it, but or they kind of just melted into the general population of the Amazon region. But so then they made it. That was the last time. That was kind of when they were most of the way through, and but then they went. As they were trying to escape, get out of the Amazon River. They had a really difficult time getting out of the Amazon River because the tide would come in and push their boat back up the river, because the river is kind of like an inland lake, and I think then the book said in 300 miles the river only descended like 300 feet. So when you look at it, you can barely even see the water flowing. So they could row up the river just as easily as row down it. But when the tide came, it would push their boat up under the river, and they wished they had anchors to help them hold their position as the tide was pushing them up. And so they had to make these makeshift anchors. And another big problem that they had was flash floods would come just out of nowhere and threaten to capsize their boats. And also there were these big trees that would float down the river. And if they collided with the tree could capsize their boat. And at one point they collided with an underwater log that pierced their boat, and they almost sunk. And they had to, at one point they had to drag their boat on shore, and they were frantically fixing their boat while they were being attacked by Indians, and they barely survived that. And also there were mosquitoes that were so bad that, like, if somebody was working on the boat or even if somebody was eating, they had to have two people with these big feathers to swat away the mosquitoes while they were eating, and take turns taking care of each other. And then getting eaten by fire ants, and it rained like every single day. So by the time, like when Francisco Pizarro, he turned around and had to go back to Ecuador, and by the time he made it back, nobody recognized them because all of their clothes had rotted away. All they had left of their clothes were just strings of just threads of wool and cotton, just because it all just got rotted away from the rain, and they had lost all their weight. And same thing happened with Orellana. Only they were able. Orellana made the trip because they would go and just raid these villages, and sometimes villages would give them food, and they could just pig out for like a day straight. And at one point there was a huge water buffalo that a dead one that they found just floating down the river that had just died. It was still warm, so they cut that up, and that fed them. So they finally made it to the mouth of the Amazon, and then somehow were able to sail in their little homemade boat that they made in the Amazon all the way back up to Colombia, where some of the Spanish settlements were, and then they made it back to Spain. But while they were going down the Amazon at one point, I don't know where it was, but they came across some other Spaniards who were part of another expedition from before, and maybe I think that was on the north coast of South America, who had gone native. There was this one guy who was a Spanish conquistador, and now he was dressed like an Indian and had two children from an Indian wife, and told his story that their boat like rotted out, and they had to escape Jamaica, and they rode a rowboat from Jamaica all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula, in in the open sea for like a couple of weeks, and then they got captured by some Aztecs and were their slaves, and they saw some of their compatriots have their hearts sawed out of their chest while they're still alive and sacrificed, so they escaped by banding together and breaking the bars in their cage they were in, and then went and lived with the natives, but then bumped into Orellana. So Francisco Orellana went back to Spain and managed to get another 4 boats together to try to go back to the Amazon. He had Amazon fever, wanted to do more exploring, which was kind of interesting. He barely survived his first trip, and then he wanted to go back. He was also one-eyed the whole time. I think he lost an eye in a fight before the whole expedition even started. And so he wanted to go back, but the king of Spain was waiting too long to give him permission to go back. So he decided to just go anyway. So he raided a little village in Spain and wounded some peasants and took their cows and pigs and just threw them on his boat and took off, even though he was ill provisioned. And one of his boats got damaged in a ship in a storm, so they had to abandon it. And then another boat just disappeared. And so then by the time he made it to South America, he only had 2 boats, but he didn't know how to find the Amazon because there's lots. I mean, it's easy to go down the river and get to land, but then how do you know which river to go up? Because there's too many choices. It funnels differently. It's a lot easier to go downriver than up. So he went up the wrong river, like 300 miles, and then got attacked by a bunch of Indians. And I guess he ended up like committing suicide after like the final 17 of his guys got murdered by Indians. But he had a 14-year-old wife, and she told that story. But then there was this other, I guess, another expedition of a guy named Guzman who decided that he was going to try to make his own kingdom in that area. So he killed off like 100 of all of the most educated Spaniards, including Orellana's widow, to try to start his own like rogue state. But then he ended up getting murdered, and his head was sent back to Spain in a box. But and then the book ended talking about what happened with Pizarro. Pizarro tried to start his own kingdom as a breakaway state. One thing that I didn't know was Spain has this encomienda system. I learned about it in college originally in college in a Central American history course, where the Spaniards came over and started. When they started their kingdom, there was like a racially segregated system where a European-born Spaniard was the highest level and could own the land, and then if you were an American-born European, that was second, and then if you had half white, half native, that was third, and then half white, half black was fourth, and then pure native was the lowest. And so but the King of Spain actually made a decree that said that that whole encomienda stuff was outlawed, and you had to treat all of the Native Americans with the same rights as the Spaniards. And so Pizarro didn't like that because it meant that he wasn't going to be as wealthy. So he murdered the representative of the governor that the King of Spain sent down, and I think he moved to Potosi and ended up finding. He was already living there, and that's when they found the big silver mine over there. I went there. There's this big mountain, and they gutted the whole mountain with silver. They're still mining it to this day. And but I don't know which Pizarro is which, but that was one of them. The first Pizarro, I think, was murdered early on, but one of the Pizarros, he murdered the envoy from Spain, and then the king sent another envoy from Spain, who then came down with an army, and was going to went to attack him in his capital at Cuzco. So he destroyed the bridge. I guess there was a bridge. The only way to get to Cusco is this big suspension bridge, but the Spanish army built another one a little bit farther upriver, and then when they went to meet to fight, all of Pizarro's guys just defected to the other side. So he had less than a dozen guys to fight with. So he just decided to surrender, and then they beheaded him, and that was it with the original conquistadors. So I didn't know that Spain outlawed the encomienda system, and those original conquistadors were some bad dudes. They were power hungry, but that is my that's what I remember from my synopsis of River of Darkness by I can't remember who. I'll be more organized next time, but 45 minutes, that's a good period of time. It was a really good read. I got through it all day very easily. It was fascinating to listen to. Those guys were very resourceful. They built boats just by they made nails out of their armor. That was the most difficult part of building a boat, making the nails out of the armor. But for one of the boats, they made 2,000 nails, and they would just hammer these things together, and then they would fill up the holes with pieces of their clothing, and then cover it up with like a certain kind of clay, and that was good enough. And it was bigger than the boats that the Indians used. The Indians just had canoes, but at one point there were huge armies of Indians that attacked them. It was like hundreds of canoes that went out into the river and tried to corner them, but they charged at the Indians and managed to force their way through with their arquebuses. He mentioned the arquebus a whole bunch of times. That big rifle, that was their saving grace. Because not only would they kill a bunch of Indians, but then they would scatter. That's one thing that you hear from ancient Roman stories is whenever they went up against the Romans, like organized armies went up against more tribal groups like the Celts in France. Julius Caesar talks about this, or even the Germans, that if you could kind of get the upper hand in the war a little bit, or if you could kill their leader, then the rest of them would just run and freak out and just disband. They didn't hold their lines very well, so they just weren't as used to fighting as the Europeans were. All right, so stay tuned to tomorrow for my Diogenes book synopsis.